a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with Fan and all. Fan, Bonnie loves it. And all of you, and especially it's a pleasure to be here with you. I teach a class at Northwestern called Relationship Science. You teach a class called Marriage 101. It's lost on nobody, which is the better class. So I'm delighted to be here with my better half. So I wanted to start by riffing on this idea of outside in versus inside out sexuality. It's one of the key ideas that really launches you into the whole thesis of your book. So can you talk a little bit about the distinction between those two ways of being sexual?
Sure. So the way we get to this is, whether I'm sitting in my therapy office with clients or in my classroom teaching graduate or undergraduate students, I'm always helping us deepen into an understanding of ourselves. We call it relational self-awareness, the idea that in modern relationships with the degrees of complexity that we are attempting to manage today, the foundation of intimacy needs to be my own ability to reckon with myself, who I am, how my culture has shaped how I show up, my expectations, my beliefs, my wounds and pain spots. It turns out when we narrow the lens from just relationships in general to the realm of sexuality, the volume gets really intense. And when we look at sex education in our country, it is highly based on showing us what to do and what not to do, mostly what not to do. And it's highly prescriptive and based on quite a bit of fear and shame oftentimes, so that we are talking about safety, which is certainly an important element of sex education. But what are we not talking about? We're not talking about pleasure and mutuality and joy and healing. And so oftentimes we come into adulthood chock full of outside-in messages. And they're highly gendered, right? The research shows that gender messaging plays out most tightly, rigidly, and narrowly around the realms of love and sex. Men are, women are, men should, women should. Mm-hmm. So right there is a whole set of, this is what I'm allowed to do and be, and all of that over there is not my turf. So I think between media today, pornography, religious institutions and schools, we are bombarded with a sense of what is okay to ask for and what's not okay to ask for. Mm-hmm. And so this process that we take in this book is we're quieting the noise and offering a journey to the interior to try to figure out by what means would you know yourself. It's I say that it's couples therapy between the reader and their erotic self.
Including, you suggest that you might have couples therapy with your vulva.
There is some couples therapy with the poor vulva.
The poor vulva,
Oft
I couldn't agree
neglected.
with you more. Yeah, it's true. So one of the ideas that I think builds on your outside in versus inside out way of characterizing how sexuality often exists today, and ideally how it exists, is you have this way of talking about when, especially for women, we often hear phrases like "you're sexy," "you're not sexy," right? There's these expectations, and you put a spin on that where you talk about "you're sexy" in a very different sort of way. Could you talk to us a little bit about the distinction there?
Sure. So we think, the word sexy is technically an adjective, and it is oftentimes for a woman poses a question. Do I get to be sexy? When do I get to be sexy? Under what conditions? And in whose gaze? Right? Do I get to experience am I experienced as sexy? Sometimes it's frightening to be experienced as sexy. Sometimes it's awesome to be experienced, but it tends to be a question. So I encourage like a journal entry or a meditation where you sort of dive into like, what are your associations with that word? But what we do in the book is we kind of flip the script and we make it into a noun. So this becomes your sexy, and your sexy is capital Y, capital S, the noun, like it is your erotic self. And we start with the premise that this is and has always been a part of you, that our sexuality, all of our sexualities, are a dynamic, unfolding, embodied part of being alive, right? Like the gift of living in a human body is that we get to have this part of ourselves, but so often it feels like it's located outside. So here it is about you're sexy and locating it within. So it's a shift from being sexy to being sexual, where it's cultivated from the inside out versus a performance or a question or a duty.
And this reminds me, you had an idea in your first book that you called I want to make sure I get it right, the name connect, choose way of developing relational self-awareness, but you incorporated some of those ideas. So for those of us who might not have the level of connection with our sexy, I don't know if we have a collective sexy, that'd be neat for everyone in this room. Congratulations to all of us.
Yay, us.
But what is this three-step process? Again, I think the book is extremely persuasive that developing a deeper sense of sexual self-awareness is pretty much a course in life enhancement. It's, life is better for ourselves, for our relationship, for our culture, right? There's this wonderful endpoint to the degree that we can develop this healthier understanding, healthier insight, healthier self-awareness about our sexuality. And so you have this three-step process. Like, for those of us who would like to do better, how could we do better?
Yeah, so as a way of going into that, I do want to say that it's always incomplete. Our sexual self-awareness is always incomplete. It's always imperfect, and it's always evolving, because whatever the heck I figure out about my sexy at this point in time, my mid-40s, I'm going to have to figure it out again in my mid-50s and then in my 60s, right? Because I'm changing, my partner is changing, our sexual connection is changing. So it's not like we're going to read this book, do all the exercises, and then be done and like locked and loaded, good for the rest of our lives, no more sexual problems. I think sexual problems, those moments of misunderstanding, disconnection are inevitable, and shifts in our relationship with ourselves are inevitable. But yeah, so the name, connect, choose process is the idea of starting with like the naming, this, oh my gosh, I'm spacing on his name. The quote, that which basically, nothing can be changed until it can be named. I'm going to think my mid-40s brain is not pulling his name up right now. Nothing can be changed until it's been named. So oftentimes, especially around sex, whatever has not been talked about in our homes, whatever the research when it comes to female sexuality, a lot of this we couldn't have talked about because the research on female sexuality has been lagging behind, right? We've got about 20 years of really solid research now, but it's still being disseminated into our hands as the end users. So there are pieces of information we don't have. So the first thing we're doing is naming, gathering the information, telling our story. And as I tell the story, so in the book we do an example of a gal who she's in her 20s, and she's in like sort of a friends with benefits relationship with a guy, and there's no connection, there's no commitment, but sort of when he, he'll booty call and then she will go. And so she had been reading Loving Bravely, and he does a booty call, and she has a pattern of when he would call, she would go, because it was just sort of the routine. And she was like, I'm going to do a name, connect, choose. And so she named, this person is reaching out, he wants to meet up for sex. And then the connect was like pausing and checking in with herself, like quieting herself down, closing her eyes, and noticing what she was feeling in her body, noticing the emotions attached to that story. So just that pause, like taking the stimulus from outside and running it through the filter of her own interior. Yeah. And what she got very quickly was a no. Like she had a bunch of homework to do. She wasn't really not interested, not available, really not up for it. And then the choose was then the choice came from that place, right? That she would have, had she been in that sort of reactive mode, she would have just been a yes, because she'd always have been a yes, and she had never really thought about including herself in that equation. So that name, connect, choose is about sort of the story on the outside, connecting with it on the inside, and then allowing that connection to self to then just open up the next pathway.
And in a broad sense, in the broader definition of the term, it's sort of being more mindful about our decision process, and it's like a three-step sequence to increase the likelihood that we're attending to what our experiences are and making decisions that are informed by those things. So you've talked a little bit about booty calls. My guess is that some people in this audience aren't that familiar. So if they wanted to be successful in making a booty call, what should they do?
I think it starts with a peach emoji.
A peach emoji?
I think it's how
Wait,
that's
hold on,
right.
hold on. I gotta write
the
this
little
down.
like drops of water. I think that has to be there. I think there's a whole
It's a good
emoji
metaphor.
thing,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
My husband does not booty call me.
Oh.
22 years into a marriage.
Work on this.
Yeah, right.
Okay. I have questions about the science. There's a lot of like totally fascinating science, including like some very fascinating biology. I really like learned a lot about the clitoris from your book, and frankly, I feel better about knowing that stuff. There's also a lot of information about how the sexual system works more generally. Hopefully we'll have time to come back to that. I want to talk for a little while here about some of the cultural implications of your book. You've clearly written into a cultural context. You wrote, within a couple of years of the Me Too movement. In fact, you probably started the book not very far after. Is that right? How far after did you start?
That was when the book started. So it was, right, so spring of 2017, my publisher was like, what are you going to write next? I was like, no, I'm good. I wanted to write a book.
Yeah.
I wrote a book, I'm good. And she was like, well, maybe just think about what you want to write. And then by the summer and fall of 2017, right, so October 17th, 2017 was when Alyssa Milano sent the hashtag #MeToo out. And it wasn't her hashtag, right? It was from the early 2000s with the work of Tarana Burke. But we were coming out of Harvey Weinstein, and so she sent that hashtag out at a moment when it just caught a wave. So within 24 hours, there were over 1 million tweets of women and people of all genders sharing their stories of survivorship. And so that was the point at which it became harder to resist the urge to write this frickin' book than to just open my laptop and start doing it, because everyone who knows my work knows I love a good both and, where there are competing things that are true at the very same time. And this moment is a both and, right? There is so much pain around the topic of sex. We are so painfully aware of the abuses of power and the misuses, and we're so aware of that. Some of the most horrific things that human beings can do to each other happen in that realm. And at the very same time, it's a time of possibility because we're naming, right? Because we can't get to a reimagination, a revolution, new possibilities for authenticity and connection. We can't get there unless we name where we've been. And so that is what's so powerful about survivors being less and less locked into that inevitable shame and silence that come with sexual violence and violation. And if and as we move out of that, that's how healing has to start, is by naming what happened to me. And that's how I get to then find my path back to who I always was.
Sexy. Stage that you were sexy.
The mic is cutting out because you can't say it.
Hey, bring me back. Do I need this? Hello?
I think you're okay now.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I want to delve into a lot of this because I think the cultural implications for your book. The book, as I understand it, is written more for individuals to get in touch with their sexuality, live a more enriched life, live a more enriched relational life, and yet you don't shy away from the cultural implications of what you're doing, which, in historical context is a radical idea that women should own their pleasure and really, really own their sexuality in a profound way. So before we get to some of the more complex issues surrounding consent and the Me Too movement, I want to start with more baseline levels of cultural dynamics. And in particular, you observe really right at the beginning of the book that women are struggling with sexuality. There's like a broad range of different things. But the superordinate idea that sort of kicks off the book, I think, is yes, sexuality is a great thing. Yes, women are highly empowered and are in many ways living profoundly fulfilling lives. And of course, many women have great relationships with their sexuality and so forth. But that there are several major ways in which women aren't living the sexual life that they would like to live. So would you mind talking a little bit about the sort of ways that you see that happening and why you think that's happening?
Yeah, so reviewing this research was really profound and eye-opening, and I think gives us a map of the territory and sort of where we need to go from here. So Dr. Lori Brotto wrote the foreword to the book, and so she's one of the premier researchers at the University of British Columbia doing this work. And there's a finding that she will use to kind of start her studies, which is that between 1/3 and 40% of women live with a significant sexual problem. It's a humongous number, and oftentimes it is low desire. And low desire we have, I think, talked about or thought about as a hormonal, medical, biological problem, which certainly that may be a really important piece of the equation. I was going to say piece of the pie, but
No.
and it is. But there's so much more going on there, right? And we can't have this conversation outside of the socialization, which locks us each into some very specific rules. So I use the framework of agency and communion to get us to some of this stuff. So in our field, we've talked, back in the 60s, there was research about agency and communion as being two different ways of showing up in the world. When we are in the energy of agency, we are acting on the world, we're leading, we're aspiring, we're acting on the world, we're agentic. When we're in the energy of communion, we are nurturing, caregiving, tending, maintaining, focusing on how everybody around us is holding up. Mm-hmm. And so researchers have found that men are higher in agency and women are higher in communion. There's a risk of essentializing that, right? And saying that just this is sort of the nature of what it is to be a man and to be a woman. Mm-hmm. And when we look at what it takes to have really wonderful sexual experiences, no matter the bodies we live in, both partners or all the partners need to be able to tap into the energy of agency and the energy of communion. Agency in a sexual realm means being able to ask for what's going to feel good, being able to say yes when it's a yes and no when it's a no, and feeling really entitled to co-create a sexual experience beginning, middle, end. But it also requires communion, right? It also requires being so grounded in myself and connected to my partner, attuned to how my partner is doing, sort of open-hearted, connected to the feelings and the emotions that are living in the space between us. But when somebody who's been socialized, so heterosexual sex ends up being the most fraught, we see the biggest orgasm gap. The orgasm gap that we hear talked about more happens most profoundly in heterosexual sexual experiences. So when you ask heterosexual men how likely they are to have an orgasm in a sexual experience, it's about 95% of them say that it's pretty much a done, it's going to happen.
Men for the win.
Not even worried about it. They'll just be like, no, it's not even a thing. You ask heterosexual women, it's only about 65% of them will say that they are reliably going to have an orgasm. And I think that is because, it's not because men are lousy lovers, because men with men are, like, the numbers are sky high for men making love with men. So it's not men as lousy lovers. It's not essential in that way. It's the problematic stuff that happens when you have somebody who's been socialized in agency making love with somebody who's been socialized in communion. Because he, in this situation, feels like he's got to be in charge because he's been told since he was this big, don't cry, don't ask questions, know your way, don't be confused. And she, since she was this big, was told, don't be greedy, take care of everybody else first. Don't ask for too much. Make sure you keep yourself kind of neat and tidy. And, nothing about sexual pleasure is particularly neat and tidy. No. So you can see that setup there. So
you do talk in the book about the orgasm gap. You also talk in the book about performance anxiety. And unless I'm misremembering, I think you say that may be a larger issue for men than for women. I don't know if you make a definitive claim along those lines, but certainly you're sensitive to the fact that men are socialized, that they're supposed to be able to perform in a way that please, in the heterosexual context, that please the woman that they're either their long-term partner or the person they're with for the moment. I wonder the extent to which the orgasm gap that women have to endure and the anxiety, the performance anxiety that men have to endure are related in that if we assume that one of the major problems that men have when they have performance anxiety is premature ejaculation. In fact, do you know the data? Is that one of the highest? Yeah, that was my understanding as well. So if men are reliably feeling anxious that they won't be able to satisfy the woman that they're with, again, the heterosexual case, and they're sitting there thinking about like baseball to try like not to have too much pleasure in the moment and this. And let's say for the sake of argument that she's sensitive to this, that she thinks he's trying, like he struggles to last as long as he would like. So in a context like that, what should she do? Well,
so we have to back up for just a moment to name the fact that the heterosexual script is so rigid and narrow and linear. And I learned it on the playground when my friends would talk about first base, second base, third base, and home run. That's the script. We have elevated we've elevated heterosexual sex above all kinds of lovemaking, but within heterosexual sex, we have elevated penetration as the most sex, the goal, the thing that we ought to be aspiring towards. Now, when you look at the research, penetrative sex is the least likely to be orgasm producing in a woman. For years, it was sort of like the female orgasm was like so elusive. Who can understand it, really? It turns out if you ask women, they can really explain a lot too. Yeah. If you ask, they can explain quite a bit. And what they will explain is that it isn't oftentimes, about 30% of the time, women will be like, yes, penetration is a really excellent route to orgasm for me. But for the rest of the population, it's not that. That's not what feels the best. It's oral sex, it's manual stimulation, it's exploring with a toy, where it's more sort of working with clitoral stimulation rather than vaginal penetration. So we have this whole thing. We have built a heterosexual script on his erection to keep the whole narrative unfolding in due time. Which is so silly because the thing he's trying to keep the erection for is potentially not even the thing that she really wants the most. So everyone has kind of gotten on this strange road to nowhere in a way that pressures him to be only one way, right? It's like all of his pleasure, he has this whole symphony of pleasure producing like body parts that now gets condensed to this one thing, and then...
It's a good one.
It's a good one. Like no shade on the penis.
Some of my best friends love that one.
No shade, zero shade. Big love for the penis. But it's just that it is perhaps, right, too much pressure for everybody. Yes. And the thing that it does create also then is a ubiquity of orgasm faking, which I don't know if we're going to go there, but
yeah, I definitely
probably should at some
want to go there.
Point go there.
Yeah, okay. So
wait, did we finish this though? I feel like we're not.
No, I think it was great, and I'm very satisfied. The answer was particularly satisfying because what led into my previous question was you sort of talking about women owning their sexuality and being assertive, but also being agentic. Being assertive or agentic, but also kind and communal. Yeah. And it sounds like you're saying that there's no reason why his anxiety about his performance needs to be a deal killer for either of them, really, and that they, through this, both of them being communal, both of them being agentic, they should be able to have the sort of conversations where all of them both of them, or perhaps all of them, can end up satisfied.
Yes, exactly. And the flip side of what we've done around female sexuality is we have taught men, the sort of cultural story about male sexuality is that it's simple, it's linear, right. It wants one thing, it is not, and so then it means that men will oftentimes, it's been really cool, and I've loved the conversations I've been able to have with men in the launch of this book because it opens up these kinds of conversations where men will then talk about like ways in which their penis is actually like a thermometer. It's like a relational, like there is data in there, and so the way we relate to erectile unreliability is we treat it is that it needs to be medicated, right? We just throw some Viagra at the problem, and I would, who am I to say Viagra or no Viagra? But I do wonder if there are times that erection is communicating something that everybody ought to understand a bit more. A friend of mine said that when he was single and in the hookup culture, he was struggling a lot he was with sort of a lot of random partners, and his erection would be really, really unreliable. And he felt a lot of shame and a lot of silence around that until he was able to make a connection. And he said, it turns out there is a direct line from my penis to my heart. And he wasn't feeling safe. And he wasn't feeling connected. And his penis is like, no, thank you. But in a culture that sort of treats male sexuality as linear and simple and always ready and always available, we don't have space for that story to exist.
Listen to the erection.
Listen to it.
I'm totally with you. Okay, let's get to some of the more controversial issues that, again,
we're not there yet.
No.
Oh God.
It's about to get real.
I'm gonna take off my jacket soon. Okay.
Actually, I don't know if this one's going to be controversial or not, but how do you define seduction? And I ask in part because if I never thought about it like a couple years ago, it never occurred to me, but if I had to define it, it might be something along the lines of trying to persuade someone to be sexually interested in you, right? So do you define seduction differently? And if you do think that it is something sort of like that understanding that I think I had for it, is seduction still something we want to encourage?
Oh my gosh.
I told you, it's about to get real.
Okay. So seduction, I think, is grown-up peekaboo.
Listen to the penis.
Right? I mean, seduction is like grown-up peekaboo. Like
Grown-up
sort of,
peekaboo.
are you there? Am I here? Where are you? Where am I? It's sort of this playful back and forth. So let's paint a picture of an ideal. In an ideal world, seduction happens between two people who feel equal ability to say yes if it's yes and no if it's no. Sure. So let's imagine that world. So I think what gets fraught is that we don't yet live in that world. But when seduction happens on a premise that we both know what's happening here, and we're playing back and forth, it's a power exchange, it's a power flow, then seduction is a beautiful way, especially for somebody who has a feminine approach to sexuality, a woman, someone who's been socialized in the feminine. It's a powerful way for her to tap into her erotic, because one of the things the research has shown is that women's erotic is oftentimes triggered by this thing called object of desire arousal, which is I'm turned on knowing that you're turned on by me, which is why dick pics don't work well for straight gals.
Note to self.
Note to self. It's not, because it's like, I don't want to see that. I want you to see me, and I want to see you seeing me. That's what's going to get me going.
Wow.
See, so it's like a dick pic is a projection of what he thinks he's taking what would turn him on and assuming it's going to turn her on, and it's the opposite.
So I just want to make sure I have it. So my phone's here. And like there's a photo of my wife here, and I'm just like,
that's right.
Okay.
And you're saying, I like how you're looking right now. Yes.
So I want to, in a moment, I'm going to get to what I think is one of the most powerful lines in the book. But I want to ask a quick follow-up to the one I just asked you, which is my understanding of seduction. Again, I think we're all still figuring this stuff out. But my understanding of seduction is that the idea is one person wants it more at the start. Right. So your response, I think, is the ideal case where like they're both equally into it, and the flirtation is firing, and the whole situation's crackling, and then they end up in bed or whatever they do.
Right.
The situation where person A is like, I really feel sexually desirous of person B doesn't have a strong inclination that way or whatever from the start. So that's sort of what I have always understood to be what seduction's about. It's like somebody being like, hey, can I tempt you? So to the degree that we're going to call that seduction or not, is that something we would like to discourage, or is there a process of doing that feels comfortable in light of what we now know about how often women have been dealing with the burden of unwanted sexual and romantic attention?
Right. Which is, so I'm sure this happens for you as well. When I talk to our Northwestern male students, their big number one fear is they are terrified of being creepy, terrified of coming across as creepy. So they feel impaired, they feel really constricted in a bar or at a party to approach a woman because they're so afraid of a seduction that is a power over kind of a thing. They're really afraid of that. And I think women I talked to on campus. I actually last week did a lunch like brown bag with the Society of Women Engineers, and we got into this topic and talking about how paralyzed they feel when they're out at a bar because they feel like the only thing they can do is sit there and wait to be approached. So that's kind of a lousy form of seduction, right? Is you've got one person paralyzed to approach, but he has to, in the heterosexual context, he has to approach because she's feeling like it's not even a possibility for her to approach him if she's interested in him. So at the end of this lunch meeting, we were sort of sharing what we had learned and their takeaway. And one gal said that her takeaway is she's going to approach somebody at a bar. She's like, I'm going to challenge myself to approach somebody at a bar, even though it makes me feel vulnerable and nervous. And I feel like because she's like, I realize I don't do that because I've been socialized not to. And fuck that. Can we say fuck? Is that okay?
I think so. We've got the approval from Lonnie, so.
F that. I'll try not to do it again. She's like, screw that. She got kind of like fiery and angry, which I think is the appropriate, I think, one of the members of my research team is here tonight, and I remember we would sit in our meetings and we would move so much shame and anger and grief through us as we worked on this book because it's just so sad how we have to kind of deconstruct seduction, when seduction ought to be something that really beautifully fires us up and creates this, but it's not. It's fraught, and it's fraught because we have been living on these really power-based, sexist transaction kinds of narratives for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, this is not a new story.
That's interesting. So the sexual scripts aren't working for women, but they're not working all that well for men either.
They're not.
So you have a line in here that I'd like to quote to you. One of the many, I think, terrific lines that when you guys buy your several copies apiece of the book, you will be able to savor yourselves. I don't know if you want to riff on this or want to view it as sort of just to let it land on its own, but you say, if women cannot say no, then women cannot truly say yes. Do you want to riff on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I get chills as you read it back to me, because I think it's so it's so important. And so the seduction example, right? So it may be that he puts something out there and he shows he's got some great dance moves or whatever, and she may not be interested. And so she needs to be able to say no, because there may be a time down the road, next week with the same guy or next week with a different guy, where she does want to say yes. But I think we have taught our men to rest their self-esteem on their ability to get a woman, that he may not respond well to her no. We hear these god-awful stories of what happens when men are rebuffed sometimes, because we teach and train our men that her attention shows you your worth. And if she's not going to attend to you, you are worthless, and therefore you are spiraling down into something that's really, really pretty dangerous. But if she can't say no and feel like it's hers, that her sexuality lives within her, and it's hers to step into or not step into, then she can't say yes, because a yes, I can't give something, I can't share something that isn't mine, right? It has to be mine in order to say, I'm so excited to share what's mine with you. So that's where that's
I mean, we've spilt a lot of ink as a society on this general issue, but that one observation I thought was one of the most powerful parts of the book. It really struck me.
Thank you.
So I'll pivot now to some relationship questions, sex within the context of relationships. So shifting a little bit away from the cultural context, although these things all interrelate. Before I do that, I think it'd be helpful for the people who haven't yet had the privilege of reading your book. Could you give us just a very brief overview of what is actually the bulk of the book, but the sort of 7 different continents or whatever it is on the map of sexual self-awareness? Do you have like an elevator pitch of the teaser? Okay, Could you give us one of those?
Yeah. So I've been born and raised at the Family Institute at Northwestern, where I did all my training. And so we take an integrative approach to therapy. Integrative approach meaning that we turn the kaleidoscope to a bunch of different places, and in each of those places we're looking for where there's constraint, where things are locked down, blocked, limited, narrow, and we're trying to create flow or ease or sort of like whatever, flow or ease, that's enough.
Perfect.
And so that is so the bulk of the book is, and I think I'm realizing I write my books like a curriculum. I just love a journey. I love a path. We're here and now we're here and now we're here. I love that whole structure works for me. So that's what we do in the book, is there are 7 different places, and it's like we land at each place, we kind of unpack some stuff, we look at, here's some information, here's some research, here's some examples, and now how is it for you? What's going on for you within this domain? How much ease do you have? How much are you locked up? Is there shame there? Okay, so now we're moving on to this next one. So we do culture, which we've talked about a lot already, developmental, which is around sort of the idea that your sexuality is an unfolding story. We do mental, which is noticing how our thoughts, right, how our brain, therapists love to say that the brain is the biggest sex organ. And so what happens around your thoughts when you're in a sexual experience, how mindful and self-compassionate are you versus distracted and self-critical. And then emotional is just really honoring that our emotions are data, and it is really worth us taking a look at how we feel before, during, and after, and just noticing that as data to guide us into what do we need more of, what should be different, what do we want less of. Physical, which is around body image, and then sort of filling in some of those knowledge gaps about female anatomy. Yeah. Relational, which is all about the space between, that there's no such thing as every sexual problem is a couple problem. Every single one. There's no such thing as I'm sexually broken and you're fine, or you're sexually broken and I'm fine, or this relationship would be fine if you could just be less needy, or you could be less frigid, or whatever. It's always, always, always a couple issue. And then the last one is spiritual. And for some of us, that sort of triangle of God, sex, and shame has been with us since we were, very, very young. And for others of us, our sex life has always been highly spiritual, and sex has always been a pathway towards the sacred, towards, sort of the spiritual dimension. But those are the 7 places that we go.
So let me pick up on before I do, one of the compelling features of the book is that for each of these 7, you have interspersed throughout the text questions that we can ask ourselves. What are the cultural messages we've gotten? What do they mean for us? The developmental process, the relational process. So it's a very user-friendly type of book in that sense. So with regard to the relational stuff, one of the issues that sort of plagues me as a researcher that's trying to make sense of how relationships work, especially in an era where our spouse or primary significant other is responsible for such a large proportion of our emotional and psychological need fulfillment, relative to earlier eras. So the thing that seems especially tricky is like doing all the things that relationship partners do. Let's imagine a case of people who are married and have a couple kids and whatever else, and then like tossing sex on top of that.
Right.
And the reason why, I think it is more bewildering the more we think about it, because if we trust, Justin Lehmiller is a sex researcher who's just done this very broad overview of sexual fantasy, but we didn't need that. That was a very good book. What's it called?
Tell Me What You Want.
Tell Me What You Want. It's a very good book. I recommend it. But we didn't totally need it because we know that people's sexual desires don't exactly follow from their loftiest political principles, let's say. And Esther Perel has this great observation that people will protest during the day over the things that get them turned on at night. Yeah. So I just wonder about the idea that I think we can call frame shifting, right? So how is it that we we cook the kids' dinner, and then we clean the dishes, and then we do nighttime, maybe we clean up some spit up, depending upon life stage, and then have just some raunchy spanking. Right. And then I don't know, maybe watch a Seinfeld and go to bed.
That's right.
It's like those things.
Were you in my house last night?
Yeah.
I feel like you know me so.
The live feed.
Right.
So again, I think that probably drives it home enough, but to put a fine point on it, it feels like you can sort of easily shift from making the dinner to hanging out with the kids to bedtime to Seinfeld, to bed. Right. It feels really weird if sex were less insubordinate, if sex just fit in with all those sorts of things, then you just fit it in somewhere and it'd be fine. But sex is so different. Not for all of us, but for many or most of us, it's so different from the other stuff we do. So how is it that we frame shift into and out of this erotic circumstance, and especially how do it when life is frantic and when there are young kids and there's spit up everywhere?
So much.
Please help.
Up. I know.
Please help.
How much time do we have?
We have all the time you need. If you can answer this, we will stay all night.
Well, I think the first thing is just naming it. The fact that you named it is a huge part of it. Because what will happen for couples is that couples feel, one partner, let's say, feels really disconnected from their desire. Sex feels like a bridge to another complete land. But the story that will start to brew is something must be wrong with me. I'm a disappointment to my spouse.
Which may be true, in fairness. Yeah.
But if that becomes my story, if my story takes on a shame loading like that, the chances that I will turn to my partner and say, babe, we are just a couple of pathetic beasts here, aren't we? It's slim to none, right? If I'm lost in a story that I am tanking this marriage because I cannot figure out how the hell to feel sexy, then the gap is only going to grow. So one piece of it is to notice when one of two things starts to creep in. Either shame, something's wrong with me, or blame, something's wrong with you. You want it all the time. You touched my shoulder, you're signaling you want sex. So that sort of like when shame or blame takes over, the couple is likely to shut down and the gap is going to grow. Versus being able to have it be open for discussion, which is also kind of, I get what a huge ask that is for couples, because where would we have learned how to talk about sex?
From the polyamorists.
From the they have got that
They
stuff
are awesome
figured
at talking.
out.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think one thing I would like everyone to consider and note, first of all, notice your reactivity when I bring it up, but this is something that I think is worth consideration, which is scheduling sex. So notice the reactivity that comes up in you, because oftentimes what I will hear is it runs so counter to the romanticized notion that sex ought to just be like, oh my God, thank goodness everyone's in bed and now we finally can get on with the what do you call it, raunchy spanking?
Are you asking me personally?
No, you said it was what you said before.
I was like,
right? Didn't he say raunchy spanking?
We're in public and they can see us.
Whatever you had said before. So that's. I lost my train of thought.
I think, game over.
The scheduling. So the idea of scheduling sex runs counter to the idea that it just ought to be that what healthy sexuality looks like is two people who cannot wait to rip each other's clothes off. Because that's what's shown to us in the movies. It's sort of that romanticized notion we live with. All of the research shows that sexual desire shifts over time. We may have lots and lots of spontaneous desire, which is sort of desire that starts with a biological, physiological urge, the experience of being horny. That may be bountiful early in relationship, but it does not, it shifts to something that now is called responsive desire. Responsive desire is responsive to cues, either internal cues, contextual cues, that then cue that actually sex would feel really good. I think that would be a nice thing for us to do. But that can really be confronting to a romanticized idea that if we have to plan it, if we have to schedule it, if we have to watch a little bit of real sex on HBO to get us going, then something is wrong with us.
So what is real sex on HBO?
I don't know. I have no idea.
No,
I just pulled that out of nowhere. How would I know?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And then another piece I think that's important is a process of like having ways of de-rolling. So especially for if it's a situation that looks rather traditional, a male provider and a female caregiver, it can be really, really, really hard for her to de-roll, to take off the heavy mantle of mothering and maintaining a house and looking at who has to be where, when, next. That is wholly antithetical to tapping into her erotic
It's
energy.
a miracle that she ever does it.
Right.
Right? She spends the whole day, there's like several, or he, whoever's doing
Yes,
it. Like,
whoever's
this is
doing
what
it.
you've done all day. And now it's like, let's do it,
Yes,
right? It's
right.
like amazing of a transition.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I really want couples and individuals. So it's a couple conversation, but it's also an individual conversation. Like we know that the science of sexuality, we know now that our sexual desire is run on a dual control model. We have an accelerator and we have a brake. So that's something that we each can do. It's a really important aspect of sexual self-awareness, is understanding how my unique accelerator and brake work. What are the contextual factors that help me feel more open to sexual connection? And what are the things that just hit my brakes? And what is it for you? And are they the same? Are they different? And so it's an individual journey that each partner would take in the service of, okay, now that we have some more data about how each of us works, because outside of that, I'm going to assume that my partner works like I do, and that my partner will assume the same about me. And maybe they do, but most likely they don't. So once each of us has a better understanding of how our own accelerator and brake works, now we can come together and do a bit of just have a conversation about it, be a bit more intentional about it. And the scheduling sex, just to kind of circle back to that, I think it can feel like another duty then. Like if we have sex on the schedule for Saturday night at whatever time, it's going to feel like another duty. But you could turn the kaleidoscope a bit and be like, we scheduled sex because we get to. What this says is that you and I so value experiencing each other in this way, having fun together, escaping the spit up for a while. We so deserve this. It means so much to us that we hold that space. And then maybe there's a little bit of texting back and forth, or each of us throughout the day is mindful about about thinking about our own accelerator and brake so that we are cultivating that sense that it's going to be something we are able to look forward to. So I think that can be a helpful intervention.
Great. I have a whole lot of questions. We're getting close to 8, so let me ask you one more, and then we'll open it up to audience discussion. So the book takes very seriously, we've talked earlier about sexual self-awareness, more broadly, I think in the space of authenticity, right, that we should be authentic about our sexual needs, our sexual desires, the stories that we've learned growing up, and learning how those interface with what our sort of actual internal desires would be if we hadn't had all this shame and expectation placed upon us. What happens in the context of, let's say, a committed long-term marriage when my authentic sexuality says that other person looks fine, fine, fine? What do you think people should do?
You're saying
about a third party. Like, I think that other person, my authentic sexuality tells me I should hit that.
I have read the book and done all the exercises, and this is what I have come up with.
Yeah, right?
That's right, yeah.
I mean, it's unlikely somebody would get there, but it wouldn't be crazy for somebody to read the book, do a lot of the exercises, and to think, maybe monogamy isn't as much for me as I thought it was, and it feels inauthentic.
Right.
That I'm holding myself back in a real way by trying to adhere to this particular set of norms. Like, what would you say to that person?
I would say hire a really, really great couples therapist. From the Family
Alexandra
Institute.
Solomon.
That's right.
You can find her on Twitter.
That's right. All the places.
Yeah.
I think that is, I think there are ways in which sometimes an individual or a couple's deep truth is that monogamy used to work, doesn't work, and so couples will make a shift either into or out of consensual non-monogamy. Yeah. I think I want consensual non-monogamy to rest on a foundation of shared power, so that it's not I'm agreeing to this because I'm scared you're going to leave me if I don't agree to it. I think that's problematic. So it's that fear-love kind of a thing. I'm choosing this because I love us, I believe in us, and I, to the best of my imagination, think this will serve us. You don't really know until you know. But I also would say that there's a world of difference between I would love to tap that and the actual tapping of that.
I believe you.
So it may be that, like, if part of this was one of the questions yesterday at the Grand Rounds, a young clinician was saying that as she expands her sexual self-awareness, she's finding as a clinician, she's having a lot more erotic transference. Erotic transference is the fancy word for feeling kind of sexually intrigued by therapy clients, which feels wholly taboo in our culture. But every training program worth its tuition money trains clinicians to know how to deal with erotic transference because it happens. And so in that response, I was talking about that that can be one of the side effects of expanding our sexual self-awareness, is starting to realize just how big and wide our sexuality is. And I think especially if you've been socialized in the feminine, there has been a cultural story that women are less sexual than men. It's a very convenient story that keeps the patriarchy just where everybody wants it to be. Right. If you look at the research, it turns out that's not really accurate. And so I think there might be an expansion of fantasy life, an expansion of masturbation, of fantasy, that doesn't necessarily translate to actually reconstructing the boundaries around this relationship. And it may be that if a partner has a richer access to their own kind of weird, freaky imagination, that then when they are with their partner, they feel like, this is really lovely for us. This really is enriching and enhancing it.